The Underground Railroad, America's Secret Network. Chapter 7: The Law Strikes Back. Part 7.1 Introduction to the Fugitive Slave Act, 1800 to 1830. What happens when the very law that claims to protect freedom forces you to hand it back? Imagine, for a moment, you are living in a land that prides itself on freedom, a land that claims to be the land of the free. Now, picture that you, or someone you care about, has just escaped slavery, an act of survival, an act of courage. You've made it to the northern states, a place of refuge, a place where you can finally breathe freely. But then, a new law comes into play, a law that threatens everything you've worked for, a law that forces you to hand back the very freedom you fought so hard to retain. That law was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It wasn't just a law, it was an act of betrayal to those who had dared to hope for freedom. It forced free states to become complicit in the system of slavery, turning what was supposed to be a land of sanctuary into another hunting ground for bounty hunters and slave catchers. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed as part of the Compromise of 1850, an attempt to maintain a delicate balance between slave and free states in the US. The law mandated that any enslaved person who escaped to a free state could be captured and returned to their owner, even if they had already found refuge in a state that had abolished slavery. The act also required that anyone aiding an escaped slave could be fined or imprisoned. What's shocking is that not only were the enslaved people at risk, but the law also placed the burden on free citizens in the North to participate in the capture and return of fugitives. Free men and women, who had no ties to the institution of slavery, were now forced to become a part of the machinery of oppression. Those who had once been free, those who had helped runaway slaves, now had to face the stark reality that they could lose their freedom for standing by their convictions. The Fugitive Slave Act turned the northern states into a minefield of moral dilemmas. No longer could a person simply assume they were safe in a free state. For those who had run to freedom, they could no longer rest easy. The law made no distinctions. If you were found, whether you had lived in a northern state for years or had just arrived, you were subject to being captured and sent back to the horrors of slavery. This new law not only struck at the heart of the abolitionist movement, but also placed an intense burden on the free states. It meant that the fight for freedom wasn't just a fight against slavery in the South. It was a fight against a government system that was willing to uphold slavery even in the lands where it was outlawed. The Fugitive Slave Act did not just target those who had escaped. It also ensnared free black people living in the North. Many who had been born free or had gained their freedom were susceptible to being captured by bounty hunters. In fact, over 300 free African Americans were captured under the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act before it was repealed in 1864. The act essentially erased the line between free and enslaved, making it a living nightmare for many black Americans living in the North. But the twist came not only in the law itself but in the consequences of its passage. The act didn't just affect the lives of runaway slaves. It forced those who had once been free into a constant state of fear and paranoia. The safety net that the North once provided was now gone. Any black person, whether they had been free for years or had recently escaped slavery, could be taken back to the South under the most tenuous of circumstances. Imagine waking up every morning, wondering whether your neighbors, your friends, might be turned into enemies, whether your life could be torn apart by a single accusation. This new law turned the everyday lives of free black citizens into an endless game of survival. The passing of the Fugitive Slave Act resulted in a dramatic increase in the number of fugitive slaves who were recaptured and sent back to their masters. Over 300 individuals were captured in the North, many of whom had been living as free citizens for years. These people were sent back to slavery under the power of the act, often with little to no evidence of their status as runaway slaves. Moreover, the law sparked widespread resistance in the northern states, leading to the formation of vigilante groups, and even the creation of safe houses that sheltered fugitive slaves. Abolitionists in the North, including figures like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, ramped up their efforts to help runaway slaves avoid capture. The law also had a profound effect on the abolitionist movement, pushing many previously neutral citizens to take action. The outrage over the Fugitive Slave Act pushed individuals from the North to take greater risks, joining the fight against slavery and participating in the Underground Railroad. However, the law's impact wasn't just about the number of people captured. It marked a key moment in the larger story of slavery in America, as it highlighted the increasing polarization between North and South. The law, meant to preserve the Union by placating Southern states, instead acted as a catalyst for increasing tensions. It pushed more people into active opposition, and many abolitionists saw the act as evidence of the moral bankruptcy of the institution of slavery. Next up, Part 7.2: The Implementation and Consequences of the Fugitive Slave Act. In the next part, we'll dive into the specifics of the Fugitive Slave Act's implementation. We'll explore how the law was enforced, the methods used by bounty hunters to capture runaway slaves, and how it turned free states into battlegrounds for a moral and legal struggle. We'll also examine the personal stories of those who were caught in the law's net, as well as the resistance movements that sprung up in response to it. If you're ready to dive deeper into the stories of resistance and bravery during this tumultuous time, make sure to subscribe to MetaFacts Legends. You won't want to miss the incredible history that unfolds right here. And don't forget to check out the description for more on how the Fugitive Slave Act affected thousands of lives. Part 7.2: The Implementation and Consequences of the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was not merely a law, but a system designed to drag free states into the very heart of slavery. It forced even free citizens in the North, who had once been able to turn a blind eye, to become a part of the machinery of oppression. The law allowed slave owners to go to free states and recapture escaped slaves without having to prove ownership beyond a reasonable doubt. It also required free states to assist in this process, effectively turning the entire country into one large slave capturing system. Imagine walking through your everyday life, when suddenly, the very ground beneath your feet begins to shift. People you've known for years, neighbors, shopkeepers, even friends, begin looking at you with suspicion. Why? Because you are free? Or so you thought. Suddenly, the Fugitive Slave Act creates a world where freedom is no longer guaranteed. For black people, both free and runaway slaves, the law was a constant threat. The question hanging in the air wasn't just, how do you survive? But, how do you survive without being caught? For those who had escaped to the North, their safety was not guaranteed. For those who had long been free, their status was suddenly questionable. The law took away a fundamental right, the right to be free. The implementation of this law didn't just lead to increased fear. It changed the very fabric of how northern states and citizens saw themselves. For the citizens of northern states, the Fugitive Slave Act represented a moral dilemma. On one hand, they could abide by the law, risking their moral integrity and potentially implicating themselves in the system of slavery. On the other hand, they could defy the law, risking prosecution, but at the cost of standing up for their values. For many, the choice was not so clear-cut. Imagine living in a town where everyone knew each other, where your community had always stood for freedom, and then being faced with the reality that you might have to turn someone into the authorities simply because they were fleeing slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act forced citizens in the North to reckon with their own values, often pushing them into a moral battle. This was no longer just a problem for the South. It was a national crisis. The law had immediate and devastating effects on the ability of enslaved people to find freedom. Between 1850 and 1860, it is estimated that more than 300 individuals were captured under the provisions of the Act, with many of them being free black individuals who had lived in the North for years. The process of enforcement was also chilling in its efficiency. Slave owners or their agents could now enter free states, approach any black person they suspected was a runaway, and demand that they be handed over. No trial, no hearing, just the authority to take the person back into slavery. Bounty hunters became a common sight in northern towns. These men, and sometimes women, were paid to track down runaways. And they would often use extreme measures to capture them. Stories circulated of these bounty hunters snatching people off the streets, even dragging them back across state lines to their former owners, or worse, to places where they would be sold back into slavery. The law also made it a criminal offense to help those fleeing. Abolitionists who helped fugitive slaves could be fined $1, a staggering amount at the time, or face prison sentences. Even those who hid runaways or aided in their escape were at risk, creating a climate of fear in the North. In the first year alone after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, over 100 people were arrested and sent back to the South. The act gave rise to a new form of terror, with enslaved individuals now living in constant fear of being dragged back into the depths of the Southern slave system. Yet, despite the seemingly overwhelming power of the Fugitive Slave Act, resistance was not far behind. Although the law was heavily enforced by federal agents, it sparked a wave of protests and civil disobedience across the North. One key resistance movement was the Underground Railroad, which evolved into an even more covert and dangerous network of abolitionists helping escapees. Interestingly, the Fugitive Slave Act, in many ways, acted as a catalyst for abolitionist activity. While the law sought to force compliance with the slave system, it also energized those who had once been passive bystanders. It pushed many Northern abolitionists to act more boldly, leading to a rise in organized resistance. The cost of defying the law was high, but the reward was greater than ever. For those involved in the Underground Railroad, the Fugitive Slave Act was not just a law to be followed, it was a call to action. A declaration that the fight for freedom would never stop, no matter what the law said. By 1860, the Fugitive Slave Act had led to a drastic increase in both the number of fugitives being returned to slavery and the number of abolitionists facing legal consequences. Many northern cities had to set up special networks for hiding runaways, using secret tunnels and hidden rooms to protect them. Abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, began to see their missions become more dangerous as more and more bounty hunters arrived in the North looking for escapees. Tubman herself was threatened with capture, yet she continued to guide hundreds of slaves to freedom. She became a symbol of the resistance, and her actions sent a clear message: the law was wrong, and she would never stop fighting for justice. This era also saw an increase in legal challenges to the Fugitive Slave Act. Northern communities began passing their own laws to protect runaways, including personal liberty laws that provided legal defenses to people accused of being runaway slaves. However, the federal government continued to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act with increasing urgency, sending armed marshals into northern states to track down and arrest anyone suspected of being a runaway slave. Next up, Part 7.3: Resistance in the North, the Nullification Movement. In the next part, we will explore how northern states began to organize against the Fugitive Slave Act, with many declaring nullification, the legal refusal to enforce the law. This movement would become a flashpoint in the growing tensions between North and South, ultimately fueling the political crisis that would lead to the Civil War. Part 7.3: Resistance in the North, the Nullification Movement. What happens when a law designed to uphold oppression is met with an open defiance? What happens when entire communities rise up against a federal law, claiming their right to resist? The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was not just a law. It was a flashpoint for a greater battle between North and South. And in the North, the fight for freedom wasn't just taking place on the Underground Railroad, it was happening in the streets, in the courts, and in the very laws of northern cities. The Fugitive Slave Act, FSA, was a monumental piece of legislation that threatened the very fabric of freedom in the northern states. Enforcing this law required citizens of free states to become part of the slave-catching machine, a role that many found morally repugnant. But in response to the FSA, some northern states and towns chose to openly reject the law, creating what we now call the Nullification Movement. The Nullification Movement was a legal and political protest that began in some of the northern states. most notably Massachusetts, New York, and Michigan, where local governments and citizens actively sought ways to defy the Fugitive Slave Act. These cities didn't just protest, they refused to cooperate with federal agents, refused to return runaway slaves, and passed their own laws to shield fugitive slaves from the reach of the law. One of the most well-known examples occurred in Boston, where local abolitionists and citizens rallied to disobey the law, setting the stage for open civil disobedience. Boston's resistance became a symbol of defiance and a beacon of hope for those fleeing slavery. Abolitionist groups helped runaways hide and escape, despite the very real threat of federal intervention. But these acts of defiance weren't without consequences. The Fugitive Slave Act, when implemented, drove a wedge deeper into the growing divide between the North and South, and northern towns found themselves struggling with their consciences. As more and more citizens began to disobey, it wasn't just the legal structure that was under attack, it was the moral compass of the nation. Imagine standing on a street corner in Buffalo, New York, in 1851. The air is thick with tension. Word has spread that federal marshals are coming, looking for runaways. The people of Buffalo know what's at stake: their freedom, their lives, and their moral integrity. But instead of waiting for orders from the federal government, the city's residents, many of them abolitionists, mobilize. They blockade streets, hide fugitives, and create false trails. The marshals march in, looking for anyone who may be on the run. But what they find is not compliance. They find resistance. They find a city united in its defiance. And when they attempt to take someone into custody, the entire community stands up. This isn't a battle fought with guns or violence. It's fought with legality, morality, and sheer will. The law might have been in place, but the people refused to follow it. The Fugitive Slave Act was a weapon of the system, but the North fought back with its people power, rising up to protect those who needed it most. The legal system might have been stacked against them, but in the streets and in their hearts, the Northerners were on the right side of history. In response to the growing resistance, the federal government found itself facing a major dilemma. Northern states and towns, which had once been compliant, now had to face the moral consequences of upholding the Fugitive Slave Act. What were they to do when the law itself was seen as an instrument of injustice? Some communities, like Boston and Philadelphia, passed personal liberty laws in an attempt to protect runaway slaves from being captured under the provisions of the act. But these laws were not enough to override the federal government. The nullification movement grew stronger as abolitionists began seeing their activism shift from protest to direct resistance. In one pivotal case in Massachusetts, a court ruled in favor of anti-slavery activists who had been arrested for assisting a fugitive. This decision sent shockwaves through the country, showing that the law was not the end of the story. Resistance could still work, communities could still fight back, and the nullification movement proved that the spirit of freedom wasn't going to go quietly into the night. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was met with significant opposition in the northern states, especially in places like Boston, New York, and Pennsylvania. There were over 300 fugitive slave cases in the first year after the law was passed. But resistance movements in cities like Boston and Buffalo saw significant victories. More than 50,000 people signed petitions against the law in the first 2 years after it passed, with thousands more organizing against it. The Act's implementation also led to hundreds of violent clashes between abolitionists and those enforcing the law. Notably, in Boston, the Anthony Burns case in 1854, where an escaped slave was returned to his master after being caught in the city, led to massive protests and even the burning of court records by anti-slavery activists. The resistance was not just a moral stand, it was also a political issue. In states like Michigan, Ohio, and Massachusetts, local courts sided with the abolitionist movement, refusing to cooperate with federal marshals. These refusals were part of a growing divide that saw the North and South increasingly pull apart on the issue of slavery. The nullification movement was one of the first signs that the country was on the brink of civil war. as people began to see the system as unjust and immoral. Next up, Part 7.4: Harriet Tubman's Role and Influence Post-Fugitive Slave Act. In the next part, we will dive into Harriet Tubman's profound influence and continued efforts after the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act. We will explore the strategies Tubman used to evade capture and continue her mission of freeing slaves, as well as how she became a symbol of resistance during this turbulent time. We will also look at historical data and explore how Tubman's work affected the broader abolitionist movement. Part 7.4: Harriet Tubman's Role and Influence Post-Fugitive Slave Act. Imagine a woman, small in stature but immense in courage, who outwits bounty hunters, evades federal marshals, and leads hundreds of slaves to freedom. Her name, Harriet Tubman, a woman who wasn't just a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but a force so powerful that even Abraham Lincoln once remarked, "Tubman may have done more for America than most generals." Yet, what made Tubman truly remarkable wasn't just her ability to navigate through the dark, treacherous routes of the Underground Railroad. It was her unwavering commitment to freedom. Even after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Act, Tubman's role became even more pivotal. The law's passage made the already perilous journey of escaping slavery even more dangerous. Yet, for Tubman, it was simply another obstacle to overcome in her relentless mission to free as many people as possible. Known as the Moses of her people, Tubman didn't just help slaves escape the South. She helped them find a way to escape the fear of being dragged back. Tubman's tenacity and resourcefulness during this period made her one of the most successful conductors on the Underground Railroad, helping hundreds of people find their way to freedom. What set Tubman apart from others was her ability to adapt. After the Fugitive Slave Act made it more dangerous for runaway slaves to seek refuge in the North, Tubman shifted her tactics. She relied on stealth, subterfuge, and a deep understanding of human psychology to lead people to freedom. Tubman didn't just walk a predetermined path. She changed the routes, redefined her methods, and became a master at blending into the shadows. She knew the law's reach and used it to her advantage, guiding those who trusted her into the safest corners of the North, and eventually, Canada. Her strategy was methodical and brilliant. Tubman would use coded language, secret hand signals, and even songs to communicate with those she helped. She would often switch her routes to avoid detection, traveling under the cover of night, and never staying in one place too long. She relied on a vast network of abolitionists and station masters who helped her along the way, each risking their lives to shield the fugitives from the law. Picture this: Harriet Tubman walking through the dense, dark woods of the borderlands between slavery and freedom. She is alone, but not really. The thousands of faces she's helped, the souls she's saved, the ones who walked by her side in silence, all blend into the night sky above her. Her mission has become more than just an escape route. It has become a symbol of resistance. Tubman wasn't just a conductor. She was the embodiment of the fight for freedom. With every rescue mission, Tubman was fighting a battle that didn't always require a gun. But the strength of her resolve, her heart, and her intelligence. As the Fugitive Slave Act tightened its grip, Tubman's work became increasingly dangerous. There was no room for error. Yet, even in those moments of extreme danger, she continued her work, unwavering and undeterred by the looming threat of capture and death. She had a purpose, and that purpose was to change the fate of those in bondage, no matter the cost to herself. The fear was palpable. Every step taken, every move made had to be calculated with precision. One mistake could lead to a lifetime of chains for those she helped. But Tubman, despite the odds, found ways to navigate the increasingly perilous journey. Her courage wasn't blind. It was informed by experience, by the faces of those who depended on her, and by the knowledge that the stakes could not be higher. In fact, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, the number of people Tubman helped increased, and she became even more resilient. It wasn't just the people she helped. It was the confidence and trust she instilled in them. Tubman knew what it meant to live in fear, And that was exactly why she was able to navigate these dangerous waters with such grace and efficiency. Her tactics became more elusive, more innovative. She knew the North was no longer a safe haven for runaways. Yet, she was the beacon of hope for those who dared to dream of a life beyond the shackles of slavery. She didn't just walk them to freedom. She gave them something even more powerful, the belief that freedom was possible. Even when the odds seemed insurmountable, Tubman's legacy cannot be overstated. It is believed that she helped at least 300 people escape slavery, making 13 rescue missions over a period of 10 years. She did this at the risk of her own life, evading slave catchers and federal agents, and navigating the most dangerous of circumstances. Tubman's impact reached beyond just those she personally helped. Her leadership and bravery made her a symbol of the abolitionist movement, and she became one of the most important figures in the fight for freedom. Her success rate was staggering. While others feared the increasing dangers of helping runaway slaves, Tubman's unwavering determination and strategy made her a force to be reckoned with. Unlike many other conductors who had to halt their operations due to the increasing danger, Tubman's fearlessness never wavered. As Abraham Lincoln himself once said about Tubman, "Tubman may have done more for America than most generals." This wasn't just a recognition of her work with the Underground Railroad. It was a recognition of her impact in shaping the course of American history. Tubman's courage inspired generations of people, both in America and around the world, to continue the fight for justice, for freedom, and for equality. Next up, Part 7.5: The Underground Railroad's Shift, becoming more secretive and dangerous. As the Fugitive Slave Act took hold, the Underground Railroad became more dangerous and secretive than ever before. Conductors like Tubman, along with station masters and abolitionists, had to come up with innovative ways to outsmart the law and avoid capture. This shift in tactics would change the very nature of the Underground Railroad, making each mission riskier for both the helpers and the escapees. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this change affected the way freedom was achieved, and how the Underground Railroad became more covert and more life-threatening than ever before. The Fugitive Slave Act marked a turning point in American history, sparking heated debates and uprisings. Which side would you have taken? Join the conversation in the comments below, and explore the full context in the description, where we've linked essential readings and documentaries on this pivotal law. Part 7.5: The Underground Railroad's Shift, becoming more secretive and dangerous. What happens when freedom is no longer just a pursuit, but a silent war? What happens when the very paths to liberty become so dangerous that even the helpers begin to question their own survival? The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it clear: no one was safe, not the runaways, not the conductors, and not even the station masters. The Underground Railroad had always been a treacherous journey, but now it was forced to evolve into something even more secretive, more dangerous, and more complex than ever before. As the Fugitive Slave Act unleashed its iron grip on the northern states, abolitionists and Underground Railroad conductors were faced with an unsettling reality. The sanctuary once promised by free states was no longer secure. Escaped slaves who found refuge in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York now faced the very real threat of being dragged back to the South by bounty hunters and federal agents. The federal government's power to track and recapture runaways meant that the Underground Railroad had to adapt and become even more clandestine. Tubman and her fellow conductors could no longer rely on public stops or widely known routes. Every journey had to be navigated in the shadows, and every station had to be kept secret from prying eyes. This meant that many stations were moved to remote locations, such as hidden cellars, abandoned homes, and isolated barns where the risk of detection was minimal. The routes themselves became twisted and winding, and some conductors even began to create false trails, turning the tracks of the Underground Railroad into a labyrinth that could confuse even the most experienced bounty hunters. But the more secretive the system became, the more dangerous it grew for those involved. Helpers faced the constant fear of being caught, thrown into prison, or even executed for helping enslaved people escape. The risks were high, and the stakes were even higher. A single mistake could mean a death sentence not just for the helper, but for the entire network. Imagine a night where the sky is thick with fog, the moon barely peeking through the clouds, and the only sound is the crunch of boots on frozen ground. The conductors, those brave individuals risking everything, move through the dark. Shadows against shadows, knowing that if they blink, they could be caught. Their hearts race as they move fugitives from one hidden location to another. Often with only the barest of supplies, sometimes nothing but their wits to survive. As the stakes get higher, so do the consequences of failure. A simple slip-up, a misplaced gesture, or a miscommunication could send an entire group into the hands of slave catchers. Or worse, federal authorities. And yet, despite the threat, these courageous conductors didn't stop. The system that once operated in the open had transformed into a network of shadows. A system where every person involved in the Underground Railroad, from the station masters to the conductors, was now in a fight for their life as much as the people they were trying to save. While the Underground Railroad became more secretive, it also became more dangerous for those who helped. Some conductors were forced to abandon the paths they once knew, and new strategies had to be devised to stay ahead of bounty hunters and federal agents. Travel times increased, routes became more complex, and helpers faced greater risks. The journey to freedom was no longer just about escaping slavery. It was now about outsmarting the law, avoiding detection, and moving with the stealth of a spy in a wartime thriller. There were close calls. Imagine a conductor leading a group of fugitives, navigating through dark woods, when they suddenly hear the sound of dogs barking in the distance. The heart-stopping terror of knowing that a slave catcher was close behind, perhaps just a few steps away, meant that every second mattered. What could have been a simple journey for freedom now became a race against time, with the added danger of getting caught by the very law that was supposed to be protecting freedom. Even as the law grew more menacing, the abolitionists didn't hesitate. Their courage wasn't just driven by a desire to help. It was fueled by the knowledge that their very lives depended on the success of the escape. The entire network was a house of cards, one misstep away from collapse. By the 1850s, the number of runaways escaping from slavery had dramatically increased, but so had the efforts to recapture them. In 1851, there were reports that over 100 runaway slaves had been captured and returned to their masters in the first year alone. The increased presence of bounty hunters and the federal marshals sent to the northern states meant that those who aided slaves faced even greater consequences. The Fugitive Slave Act had turned free states into dangerous territories, where helping a runaway could result in arrest, imprisonment, and, for some, even death. However, the law didn't stop the abolitionists. While many in the South found ways to enforce slavery, the North found ways to fight back, not with weapons, but with determination, intelligence, and a refusal to give up. The Underground Railroad became a symbol of resistance, a battle waged quietly in the night. This shift made the Underground Railroad more secretive and dangerous, but it also marked a turning point. The network became more organized, more elusive, and more determined, no longer just about freedom. It became an act of defiance, a rejection of a law that tried to bind people in chains. Next up, Part 7.6: National Reaction and the Build-Up to the Civil War. As the Fugitive Slave Act continued to stir conflict, the fight against slavery became more heated. The tension between the North and South was palpable, and the law ignited protests, court cases, and the mobilization of abolitionists. In the next chapter, we will explore how public reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act began to fuel the movement toward the Civil War. Part 7.6: National Reaction and the Build-Up to the Civil War. What happens when a law that's meant to bind a nation together tears it apart instead? The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 did more than just force runaways back into chains. It sparked a nationwide reaction that would set the stage for one of the most significant conflicts in history, the Civil War. The law that was intended to maintain order and control over the institution of slavery only served to inflame tensions and divide the country further. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 was meant to resolve the growing tensions between the North and South over slavery. It was intended to enforce the return of runaway slaves, even if they had escaped to free states. However, the law backfired. It did the opposite of uniting the country. It ignited protest and strengthened the abolitionist movement. In the northern states, where slavery had been abolished, the law was met with outrage and resistance. The idea that free citizens could be forced to capture and return escaped slaves went against the moral values many in the North held. Cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia became hotbeds of resistance, with abolitionists organizing protests, legal challenges, and public demonstrations against the law. The reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act fueled the abolitionist movement. It gave rise to new leaders, new strategies, and an outpouring of public support for the cause of freedom. In the North, underground networks were expanded, and rescue missions became more frequent. People who had previously turned a blind eye to the plight of enslaved people were now forced to confront the injustice. Many who had once believed slavery was a Southern problem now realized it was a national issue, and they began to fight back. Picture the streets of Boston, where a crowd of abolitionists gathers, their voices rising in unison as they protest the Fugitive Slave Act. The atmosphere is electric with defiance, men and women of all backgrounds standing shoulder to shoulder, demanding that the law be repealed. In the background, a group of runaway slaves quietly slips through the crowd, seeking refuge in the city. Their faces are filled with hope, but also fear that at any moment, federal marshals could appear, dragging him back to slavery. But even as the law seems to suffocate freedom, the defiance grows stronger. Voices rise in protest, the resistance swells, and the North's resolve to stand against the law becomes a beacon of hope. As the abolitionist movement grew, so did the tensions between the North and South. The Fugitive Slave Act was not just a law, it was a symbol of the deep divide between the two regions. The North increasingly saw itself as the last bastion of freedom, and the South viewed the law as a necessary measure to maintain the institution of slavery. This ideological conflict led to a flood of protests and the formation of political factions that openly defied the law. Cities like Buffalo and Chicago became known for their opposition to the act. While in Congress, the debate over slavery reached a boiling point. In one particularly tense moment, citizens in Boston even declared the Fugitive Slave Act null and void within their city limits, refusing to comply with its provisions. The decision to declare such defiance publicly showed just how deep the divide had become. The Fugitive Slave Act had transformed into not just a legal matter, it had become a battle for the very soul of America. This was no longer simply a law about runaway slaves. It was now about freedom versus oppression, moral authority versus political power. The reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act wasn't just a few isolated protests. According to historical records, over 300 individuals were arrested or captured as a direct result of the law's enforcement, including fugitives and abolitionists who helped them. This was just the tip of the iceberg, as many fugitives went into hiding, and abolitionist networks had to become even more secretive. The act also resulted in a dramatic increase in the number of slaves attempting to escape, many of whom chose to go further north, risking everything for the chance at freedom. In response to the growing resistance, the federal government began to tighten its grip. Federal marshals were sent into northern states to enforce the law, and citizens were required to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. The tension between states that adhered to the law and those that resisted it created an increasingly hostile atmosphere that only served to fuel the anger and outrage of those who opposed slavery. Next up, 7.7 The End of Slavery and the Unintended Consequences of the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act ultimately had a paradoxical effect. Though it was designed to strengthen the institution of slavery, it instead sparked the flames of the abolitionist movement in a way that could never be undone. The tension it created between the North and South helped fuel the outbreak of the Civil War. But it also accelerated the end of slavery by galvanizing those who fought for freedom. In the next chapter, we'll look at how the Fugitive Slave Act inadvertently became a catalyst for the end of slavery, and how it helped the abolitionist movement gain the momentum that would lead to the ultimate collapse of the slave system in America. Part 7.7: The End of Slavery and the Unintended Consequences of the Fugitive Slave Act. What if the law that was meant to tighten the chains of slavery actually became the catalyst for its destruction? The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was designed to enforce slavery, to keep it alive and thriving, even in the northern states. But in a twist of irony, it fueled a fire that would burn through the system of slavery itself. The law that was supposed to keep people in chains actually helped free them, setting off a chain reaction that would end slavery and launch the Civil War. The Fugitive Slave Act was intended to be a final solution, a way to maintain control over the ever-growing number of runaway slaves. By requiring all states, even free states, to participate in the capture and return of escaped slaves, the law sought to prevent further disruption to the institution of slavery. The hope was that by enforcing this law, the South could maintain its hold on its slaves, and that the North would be forced to cooperate with this horrific practice. But, ironically, the law became one of the most important turning points in the abolitionist movement. For many people who had once been apathetic about slavery or uncertain about its morality, the Fugitive Slave Act forced them to take a stand. It turned passive sympathizers into active fighters, determined to resist this injustice with all their might. The Fugitive Slave Act didn't just mobilize abolitionists in the North, it brought together people from all walks of life who were united by a common cause, the fight for freedom. Anti-slavery organizations, churches, and activists across the North rallied together, organizing rescue missions, sabotaging the law, and increasing efforts to help runaways escape. This growing resistance only intensified as more and more people realized that the law itself was pushing them to act, and pushing the abolitionist cause to the forefront of the national conversation. Imagine a world where every street corner in northern cities becomes a battleground, where people, once strangers, are now united by a common goal, standing up to an oppressive force. In the shadows, abolitionists and station masters move in silence, knowing that each step could mean the difference between life and death for an enslaved person. But the Fugitive Slave Act has pushed him to the edge. The stakes have never been higher. Every rescue mission is a race against time, a chase between the fugitives and the law. And yet, it is this very conflict that will provide the momentum needed for the Civil War to ignite. As the Underground Railroad becomes a lifeline for those escaping slavery, it also becomes a hotbed of resistance. Every slave that is rescued, every slave catcher thwarted, adds fuel to the fire of revolution. This law that was designed to keep people in chains now becomes the spark that will eventually set the nation on fire, tearing the country apart and igniting a war that will reshape the future. As northern states increasingly reject the Fugitive Slave Act, the very people who once supported compromise now find themselves on the front lines of a battle for freedom. In towns like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, abolitionists use every available tool to undermine the law: public protests, legal challenges, and even direct action. The law that was meant to quiet the abolitionist movement has done the opposite. It has galvanized it, pushing people to fight harder than ever before. But this battle is not without its consequences. As the law tightens, northern cities become more divided, with citizens forced to choose. Will they obey the law, or will they stand against it? Some may have been reluctant to support abolitionism before, but now they're forced to make a choice: to fight for what's right, or risk losing their soul. As the Fugitive Slave Act took effect, it dramatically increased the number of people seeking to escape to the North. In fact, the number of runaways attempting to escape increased by over 60% after the law was passed. In 1851 alone, it is estimated that over 150 fugitives were captured and sent back to slavery. In response to this, the abolitionist network became more organized, turning to new tactics, including the use of secret codes, underground stations, and safe houses to protect runaways from being captured. But despite these efforts, the law's enforcement led to intensified conflict. Northern abolitionists formed organizations like the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and the New England Anti-Slavery Society, which publicly denounced the law and organized rescue missions to help those in danger. The resistance grew louder, and the abolitionist movement gained more and more support as people recognized the unjustness of the law. Public opinion shifted toward abolition, and vocal opposition to slavery became stronger than ever before. The Fugitive Slave Act was not just a law. It was a catalyst, igniting resistance that ultimately led to the collapse of the institution of slavery. While the law's purpose was to preserve the system, it inadvertently accelerated its end by galvanizing those who stood against it. The abolitionist movement grew stronger, becoming a driving force that would tear the nation apart in the Civil War. But the aftermath of these struggles didn't just end with the war. It reverberated through the very fabric of American society, sowing the seeds for the civil rights movement in the 20th century. The Fugitive Slave Act didn't just fuel the fires of war. It helped strengthen the forces of freedom and justice, providing the momentum needed for the eventual collapse of slavery. Its consequences shaped the course of American history, propelling the fight for equality into the 20th century. As the echoes of freedom continued to resonate, the law's push to reclaim power over human lives ultimately backfired, proving that the pursuit of justice can never be suppressed, only delayed. Next up, Chapter 8: The Echo That Still Whispers. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the Underground Railroad's legacy continued to echo through the nation, leaving a lasting imprint on the civil rights movement. As many Underground Railroad sites turned into national monuments, the lessons of those who fought for freedom remained alive. Harriet Tubman's words, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death," became more than just a rallying cry. They were a testament to the enduring spirit of the freedom fighters whose struggle paved the way for future generations. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act wasn't just a legal decision. It was the beginning of a more dangerous fight for freedom. If you're moved by the stories of resistance, hit subscribe, share this video, and check out the description for a wealth of additional resources that will shed light on this powerful moment in history.